called Doran Tukufano, called Bridget Toka Ingawa. I think I said all that last time, but here we are again. Great to see you all again. Obviously a really great group of people. I had a really good time with you all in Hafiz's session on Tuesday, so looking forward to spending a couple of hours with you today to talk about the who of raised crossings. So what we're going to do is talk about who uses raised crossings, why that's important, and really this whole module is an introduction to what's the point of all our jobs anyway. Why do we work in transport? Why are we concerned about safety and inclusion? And a lot of what you'll learn today and discuss and do exercises in is really quite foundational. I think, a bit biased, but I think it's foundational for your career as a whole. Raised crossings happen to be a really good example of the art and good application of thinking about who's using the infrastructure we're planning and designing, but really this is about your careers and what influence you can have as professionals on people, because if we're not having a good influence on people while being mindful of the planet, then what's the point, right? So today there's kind of 4 sections that we'll go through. The first is why inclusion is important and what we mean about people and designing for them. We'll talk about transport psychology. As Prue said, that was what my PhD was in, cognitive psychology. And so this intersection of driver behaviour, cyclists and pedestrian behaviour, the way that infrastructure design can affect people's conscious and unconscious processes and what all that means. I spend a lot of time thinking about thinking. In fact, I was thinking today about it. and you know how they say that if you spend 10,000 hours on something, then that's your expertise. If there's anything I've spent 10,000 hours on, it's thinking about thinking. And so I think that I'm a thinking expert, if anything. Well, certainly in my own brain anyway. I'll carry on. So, and then the principles of inclusive transport, SOS, and what that stands for and what it means in the context of raised crossings and how we can use it to design them better. And then we'll also go through disability sector engagement. And by then you'll be like, yeah, I understand why this is an important thing. Let's talk about how that works and how we can take that away and learn more about it for our day jobs. So before we start, there's just a bit of a, which I like to do this whenever I'm talking about disability or inclusion. The language of disability can be a bit of a confidence barrier for people to not talk about disability because they're not sure what words to use. So in New Zealand, and my default phrase is to talk about disabled people. And that's because disabled people want to be talked about in that way. So this language came from across government engagement with disability communities. In New Zealand, we use disabled people. In Australia, it's usually people with disability and then sometimes disabled people, but the best way to find out what it is, what's the kind of go-to phrase in your area, is to talk to people in those communities and people who work with them, and then you can find out. So you'll hear me talk about disabled people quite a lot because that's the default way of doing it. So firstly, why is inclusion important? We're going to talk about humans and human factors. At first, there's just a few stories I'll tell you based on real people's experiences with transport. So the first one is about Martha, and Martha was commuting to work by train, and she had to change trains, sitting on a train station platform waiting for the next train, which was due any minute. And then she noticed that people around her got up and kind of stood there for a second, and then a lot of people just left the platform. She didn't know why that was, and then soon she saw those people boarding a different train on another platform, and she realised that her train was cancelled and it had moved. But Martha was deaf, and there had been no announcement except an audible one to let the passengers know that this change had happened. So that meant that Martha was late for work and stressed and a bit frustrated at missing that connection. The next story is about Lara and Kelly, and again, this is a true story with different names, but Lara and Kelly wanted to travel to a concert, and they are friends and they both use wheelchairs. The concert was about 2 kilometres away. They don't have their own vehicle, so they were going to use the bus to get there. And so they went to the bus stop, and the first bus that came past didn't kneel or have a ramp available. So the driver stopped and explained that to them and then carried on. The second bus that came along, there was already someone in the wheelchair spot on that bus who had a buggy, and it was too contentious or difficult for that person to move. So they didn't get on that bus either. And the third bus was full and just drove straight past. So at this point, they gave up on the bus and decided to wheel themselves up and down the hills of Auckland to get to the concert. And the concert venue had been advertised as accessible, so they assumed they'd be able to get in, but when they got there, they found that even though it had an accessible toilet, there were steps to get in the main entry and no alternative ramp. So they gave up at that point and wheeled themselves home again. And this is kind of typical of what we hear about the stories of life as a disabled person, and it's really why inclusion is important, because it really affects people's everyday lives. And it is not the everyday lived experience of a lot of people who work in transport. This last story is about Duncan, and Duncan uses a guide dog, and there were some new tactile pavers installed at an intersection near his house, and he aligned himself with the tactiles as he's trained to do. He's well versed in how to walk around independently in his own community when there is tactile paving, but in this case the tactiles had been installed incorrectly, and they were aligned such that when he walked out into the intersection, he was going into the middle of the intersection and not across the street where he wanted to go. And it was only because his partner was with him and said, "Oh, whoa, hang on, that's not the right direction, that's not where you're supposed to be going." So I happen to know this person, and he's had a lot of robust conversations with the local council, but it really speaks to a broader issue around the culture of compliance with standards, and perhaps a lack of understanding of why those standards exist and what the purpose of these kinds of devices is, and how it can affect people's lives. Because if this kind of experience happens to people over and over, then you can imagine that even the effort of going for a trip in the first place is more than it would be for somebody who is not a disabled person, because many of us can cope with disruptions in our journey or route because we have a multiple ways to get around, multiple ways to access information. We're, quick on our feet and with our smartphones, and we're on top of things. And we also speak the language of transport, which I'll talk a bit about later. But a lot of people living their everyday lives have some constraints, which mean that some of those things are difficult. And so we should.
Bridget, I've just got a question.
Sure.
This is an interesting one. There's a couple from Michael Langdon, but I like this one. He's first asked about how important is lived experience when making decisions about disability issues. But then he said, would you recommend using an access consultant that does not have lived experience?
We'll come to that later. That's a complex issue. I would say, because I'm biased, use an access consultant or who works with the disability sector. That's what we do at MR Cagney, for example. So I don't think it's sufficient to have one or the other. You can't have a consultant who doesn't have a relationship with the disability sector and doesn't have lived experience. Equally, it's dangerous, I think, to use a disability consultant who doesn't understand transport processes and language. And I've seen some examples where a disability sector consultant will recommend things that I wouldn't recommend because of the background context around safety and transport efficiency and politics and all of those other nuances that are really important when you're making recommendations about street infrastructure. So I would recommend you get a trusted access consultant.
And we're not looking at one person's perspective. We're providing for a whole community. And
well, that's exactly right. Yeah, and I talk about that a bit later in the disability engagement bit. It's also, there's a guide in the learning management system that I wrote with the disability sector about engagement, and it talks about that exact thing, that we need to be very careful to be as inclusive as possible in the way that we engage. So as I said in those stories, there's an effort to living as a disabled person and navigating street contexts. And so we hear things like this story. Whenever you do research and ask disabled people about transport, they have a lot of examples and stories of when it was just too hard to do things. So people will say, there is a trip they haven't made because of a transport challenge, and trips not made is a kind of emerging metric that a lot of us are using to explain the cost of not providing inclusive environments. So this one, for example, would have been an absolute nightmare: unreliable trains, no close parking, having to pay for both on a low income. All of these things combined means it seemed like a nightmare, so someone said they just didn't go, they didn't make that trip. As I said in the story about Duncan, tactile ground surface indicators can make or break a journey or a person. Many people can't read the language of infrastructure, and I've talked with people from Blind Low Vision, which is the main New Zealand service provider for blind and low vision people, and they say that quite a big proportion of the blind community don't know what tactiles are even. And where I live, the staff member I talked to estimated that up to 50% of blind people don't know what tactiles are. So we have to be very careful that when we specify them, they're at least correct, or else we're paving these footpaths in gold that doesn't necessarily help people, especially, or, you know, it does much more harm than good if they're still installed incorrectly. So we need to be really careful about that. And we'll talk about this later as well, but the language of transport, it's interesting to try and look at the world. When you're trained in transport and say you're driving down a state highway in New Zealand or a highway, it's hard to try and imagine what that road looks like when you're not trained as a road engineer or a transport planner, because we see things that other people don't see. For example, when I was a civil engineering graduate and I was doing some work on road construction sites for practical experience, and I learnt what an edge marker post was, and I felt like I'd never even seen one in my life, even though I clearly had driven past them thousands of times. All of a sudden, I was seeing edge marker posts everywhere and saying, oh, that one's been clipped, that one's needs replacing, that one's must have been hard to install. But the public are just out there living their lives and don't know what tactiles are. Or, you know, a lot of the signage or markings or reasons that we do things are not obvious. People literally never think about them. So try that exercise if you're out and about walking or driving. Try to strip your brain of its knowledge about transport infrastructure and see if you can do it. And spoiler alert, it's impossible. It's impossible to take these frames, these lenses out of our head once we've learned things. It's impossible to unlearn them, which is why we need, ongoing professional development and training and how to do these things well so that other people can use them.
And that communication with the community, like often when you talk about something or I explain something to someone or I ask them a question, it's like, I find it really interesting what they describe like a refuge crossing as, because
totally.
All different words, like, some people say there's no crossing there. There's,
100%. I was thinking that as well. And I think that's what's so good about raised crossings is, what would people call them? The public, well, they'll say, oh, it's a proper crossing. It was, they wouldn't think of a curb cut as a crossing. So, and some people only think of signals as a crossing. So it's important to check ourselves and our language. And when I'm explaining to my family, for example, if I'm walking around and want to take a picture of a curb cut, because that's a fun thing to do on the holidays, they're like, oh, what are you doing? Oh, I see these yellow dots things. This is what they are and this is what they're here for. It's interesting exercise to realize that most people engage with these things on a daily basis and have no idea that they're even there. So why is all of this important? Well, it's legally important. We have human rights obligations to comply with laws that mean we don't prohibit people's access to opportunities. And that's interesting because we don't obey those laws. Disabled people, and a lot of people actually, a lot of humans are prevented from accessing things that other people can access because of historic infrastructure decisions. And it's very difficult to tease out the fault of any individual or organisation for those things. So there's no case law in terms of, oh, I'm going to sue the New Zealand government because I couldn't get to this location. Well, it's not any one department's fault, is it? It's just the legacy infrastructure that is not seamlessly up to standard to make that journey possible. So it's very complicated. But sometimes the law is helpful to remind people we work with about why we're doing some of these things. And in New Zealand, you know, most government policies around the world in terms of transport all say these nice words, don't they? They say we're going to have accessible, inclusive environments. Increasingly, they talk about equity and well-being. We want to reduce adverse effects on the climate, the environment, and public health. And the health and well-being of people is, you know, a really broad term. I work quite a bit these days in things like reducing loneliness and increasing social connectedness, and how transport can do that and who it can do that for. In New Zealand, for example, in our lockdowns, we in the transport sector often talk about what a nirvana it was for walking and cycling around local streets during lockdowns because the traffic was so much lower, traffic volumes were lower. But actually, I did a survey of disabled people in lockdowns, and they left the house a whole lot less, about only 10% as much as non-disabled people did, because of a variety of reasons, and inaccessible infrastructure is one of those reasons. So we need to be careful about who we're talking about when we say, oh, this is how it is.
Bridget, a couple of questions.
So when we're thinking about, another question.
Sorry, there's a couple here. We've got, what are the penalties for not obeying disability laws? And also a comment that Jeremiah says it's challenging to translate into actual infrastructure in New Zealand, these the treatments needed, I think.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're going to get to that. How we do it in practice. It is challenging, and it doesn't fit nicely in a box, which is, I think, why road safety has a better time of it, in terms of there are a lot more road safety professionals, a lot more comprehensive policy for that, because we know exactly what we're doing in terms of we want to reduce crashes and reduce trauma. Inclusion, we want people to get places, but we don't measure our failure to do that, and I'll come to that a bit later. I don't know of specific penalties because, like I say, I don't know of any case law in New Zealand where sometimes organisations are challenged for not having access to a public building, so they'll challenge in a town hall, you know, that's old and doesn't have a ramp. They'll take them to court and they'll have to put in a ramp. But for public infrastructure, it's not so clear cut, because there are often ways for people to get places. It's just that it's not as easy and direct for some people as it is for others. So I don't actually know of any case law in New Zealand. I don't know of any in Australia, but I haven't looked that far in terms of disabled people or organisations challenging a government around access in terms of a road crossing or you know, a path somewhere, or even mobility parking. And I've talked quite a bit about disabled people, but actually this is about all of us and our varying capabilities and states. So we're not all Olympic athletes, right? Like, we're not all superhuman, Superman can do all of these things perfectly. And where some of us are certainly not as physically capable as we once were. So there's a whole spectrum of abilities that people have. Pick whichever one you want and think about, actually, sometimes I'm compromised. Sometimes these things vary day to day. Certainly people in your own family and amongst your friends, you'll recognize that there are differences in people, right? Just yesterday, one of my uncles fell over and broke his hip. You know, these kinds of constraints can come upon us at any time, and they affect the capability we have, which affects the kinds of infrastructure we need to move around. And on top of the physical capabilities, we also have different kinds of states, right? Different amounts of energy. I like to say that a human state, this is a new one for you, Prue, humans, you know, where you are in your life is a combination of nature, nurture, and luck. And we all have these baseline levels of energy based on our nature and our nurture to some extent, and the habits that we've grown up with or proactively made ourselves stick to. But it's also luck, right? Like if you fall over and break your hip, that's bad luck. So we have different amounts of energy, we have different levels of anxiety or stress. Some people spend a lot of time in chronic pain. I was just reading today that they estimate maybe up to 25% of women suffer from endometriosis, so quite debilitating period pain, you know, for a week, a month. That's a pretty high proportion of the population that's out and about there and actually doesn't want to be jumping over hoops just to get out for a coffee. So there's a spectrum, and we're all humans, we're all somewhere on a spectrum. We're not just robots, robot commuters going about our day and getting to work. So this is my new mirror exercise, and I haven't even changed this instruction because it's incorrect. We're going to jump over to Miro and go to exercise 1, which I've changed. This is just new, just for you people, because I was inspired to do something different for you. And we, like Prue said, I like to convert thinking into graphs and diagrams and stuff. So this is the graph of how are you feeling today. And what I want you to do is to have a post-it or a sticker or an emoji that represents you, and then put it somewhere on these axes. So the vertical axis represents your energy. How are you feeling today? Are you on top of the world? Are you really alert, or are you a little bit sleepy? You know, you just had a really big breakfast and you're like, oh, when is this going to be over? And then on the horizontal axis, we've got physical health, flexibility, fitness. How strong are you? How capable are you? So let's all put ourselves somewhere on these two axes in terms of where you think you are. How do you feel? Awesome. We've got some starting off there. When I made these axes on Tuesday after our session with Hafez, I was wondering where to put energy, because it's not on either of those axes, right? But it's both, isn't it? They've got physical energy, how much calories you're converting into energy, and then there's also obviously mental energy, your energy for thinking, for processing. I think that's why people get home at the end of the day and they like to, you know, Netflix and chill. It's literally turning off your conscious brain and just zoning out. So this is
with morning people versus night people as well.
Totally. Yep. I am definitely more of a morning person, and introvert and extrovert tendencies. Like, I think of those things as a spectrum as well. And it depends how much of your day you've had to be on and, you know, talking to people, teaching them about all this stuff. it can be draining, right? Okay, so we've got a lot of activity up in the top right quadrant, which is great. That means you're alert, you're feeling good, you're fit and sprightly. Now, what I want you to think about is you can either take your emoji or sticker or pick yourself a new one. Imagine that it was you who fell over last night and broke your hip. And so I'll tell you this little story. This actually happened to my uncle in Auckland. He didn't know that he'd broken anything. Obviously, he fell over and he's in pain. And then it took 3.5 hours for the ambulance to show up because there's chronic staff shortages in the New Zealand health system. So he spent all night in hospital not knowing what was wrong, and he's in pain. And now he's in hospital wondering what his prognosis is. If that had happened to you, where do you think you would be now?
Am I just going to move it on the same board, Bridget?
You can just move it over to where you think you might be if something like that happened to you. Not great, right?
No.
Nobody's gone in that direction, like towards the northern ends of the axes. Things happen to us, and I think that's possibly a helpful way to think about inclusion and why we want to think about it for transport, because most people coming to work and working on this stuff are kind of at the top of their game, and actually you're quite high performing humans. If you ended up in this kind of professional role, you're pretty competent, you've made it, you probably had a little bit of privilege in your life compared to some other people, and yet the systems we're designing are for everybody and all of this range of experiences. And in New Zealand, 1 in 4 people says that they are a disabled person. That's way higher than the proportion of disabled people in our jobs. So it's important to think about this all the time.
A bit of a gripe here, Bridget. Sometimes when I am looking through guidance and I see something like where there's high, you know, you might want to think about a crossing where there's high numbers of elderly people or children. It's like, you know, it's just like, I think we're at the point where we know at every location where people want to cross the road, we can expect elderly people or children or people with this.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think it was a little conversation with Michael in the chat on Tuesday about nursing homes, for example, because nursing homes in particular, actually, a lot of people who are in nursing homes don't leave them very often. Like the demand for crossing the street is nowhere near as high there as it is in a residential area where there's houses and a shop. People will want to go back and forth, and we want those crossings to be as safe and inclusive as possible, because my uncle might live there and he might be recovering from surgery and need to get across the street. So as good as we can do. Great, you did that exercise very well. I'm very pleased with you.
Are we going to give out any prizes here? I was just impressed that somebody had a caterpillar and I just felt like that earned a prize.
Okay, if the caterpillar is yours, you can own up in the chat and you'll get the special Prue's Caterpillar Award of the day. Now we're going to move on. I feel like we could talk all day. If you want to, we'll try and finish within 2 hours. So we'll carry on. This next slide is really important to me because I had my eyes open to the impact of income a few years ago when I was working on a project about equity, and it's actually a public report, Equity in Auckland's Transport System, if anyone's interested. The thing that equity does, income does, is that it enables people to overcome some of the other challenges in their life. If you have a high income, you've got more choices in terms of where you live, how you live, and particularly how you get around. So if you're not feeling so good one day, you might choose to drive or get an Uber rather than bike. Or if you've got a bike, and you know that it breaks down, then you could just phone someone up or ring for help or lock it and get an Uber. It just gives you a whole lot more choices from the outset. People who have low incomes just don't have those choices, so their lives are a whole lot more limited. So now we're going to go straight back into Miro. We'll stay there if you are there. And exercise 2, just underneath the exercise 1. This is just to get us all thinking about income and what it might have to do with raised crossings. So pick an emoji or sticker and have a read of these statements and pick a sticker or emoji or comment that says how you feel about that statement. Whether you agree with it, disagree with it, whether it concerns you, whether it's contentious. The first statement says poorer areas get less infrastructure investment. That is a citable fact around the world, as well in terms of countries as a whole. Poorer countries have worse infrastructure than wealthier countries. Within wealthier countries, even within cities, poorer communities have worse infrastructure than wealthier communities for a variety of complicated reasons. How does that make you feel? The second statement is poorer people are less likely to have a car, so they are forced to walk. What do you think about that? We have stats in Aotearoa New Zealand, in any case, about household access to a car. And increasingly, those stats are a bit more complex to interpret because in some parts of our cities, there is freedom associated with not owning a car and people are choosing not to, usually when there are other options around, right? Especially car share. So when car share is flexible and widespread, then a lot of people choose not to own a car. The third statement is people in fancier cars are less likely to give way to pedestrians. And that one came from a study that I found, and I'm not sure whether it's been replicated. In other words, it might have been a rogue study. I don't know. But in that study, they found that surveying the make and model of cars and whether they gave way to pedestrians at a zebra crossing, they found that BMWs and Mercedes, for example, were statistically less likely to give way to a pedestrian. I mean, there's not a perfect correlation, but that's what they said. So I just like thinking about these things, and maybe especially because we work in transport and we all move around a lot, when you're out and about, have a think about your own privilege, your own life experience. I'm sure we have a whole diverse range of people in this webinar from different backgrounds. We've all had, for better, for poorer times in our lives. Think about how that influences your perception of the world, the decisions that you make, and perhaps empathy for people who don't have as many choices as we do. So we will move on.
Bridget, does that especially apply to things like accessing public transport? In my mind, I kind of think of bus stations for people who don't own a car or can't drive a car, that, that is maybe their only connection.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. And there's studies, I remember one from Melbourne, from Monash University, about, transport disadvantage and the extent of public transport networks. Because if you have a big city, then obviously public transport is better the closer you get to the city centre in somewhere like Melbourne. If you live in an inner suburb or in the inner city, you've got lots of different options and trams and trains and buses. The further out you get, and this is the same in Auckland and Wellington, then you might live in an area that only has a bus route, and it might be quite an infrequent bus route. So yeah, you live in a city, but there's obviously different levels of access within those cities. And so, yeah, the bus can be the make or break, and there's stuff that we can do about that. And sometimes it starts with helping people to get around by walking, right? If they can't even walk to the local bus stop or access it, then that's a problem for sure. So as we've kind of alluded to, impairment can be permanent or not. It might be that you have people who are born with a disability, and they'll identify like that. And then there are situations that we encounter in our lives that affect the way that we move around. And this example table is from the link right there, Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, it is called. And it's a really easy, well, I think it's a really neat way to explain different kinds of impairments to people you work with. And I've used this with colleagues and at workshops and things. It can be a nice thing to share in your office. If people are asking you what you're learning on this webinar, share this toolkit, because this image is, people can relate to it really easily. So yeah, there's permanent impairments, and that's probably what we're most familiar with talking about disability, but there's also temporary ones, which are usually like an injury or illness. But then there's situational impairments, which I think is a really good one to relate to. And I like to think about transport situational impairment being trying to carry a suitcase on wheels through the Paris metro system, because the Paris metro system is not very accessible, and it has a lot of steps that you come across all of a sudden, and you've got to lug your suitcase over them. That's a situational impairment, and we can learn a lot about transport infrastructure when we are situationally impaired, like you're carrying a baby, for example, or you'll notice some cafes are way louder than others, and it can affect what you can hear. Yeah, there's lots of different examples, and I think it's a really useful resource if you're interested in looking that up. It also reminds me that the most inclusive places that I know in the whole world are airports, because airports are designed for luggage with wheels, and that means that they're the most accessible places in the world, because they also have a lot of travellers who don't speak the basic language, so they have this very intuitive wayfinding system. It's very easy to find where the toilets are, and the lifts, and it's all nice and smooth and open and easy. We can learn a lot from airports. In fact, some people have said to me that mobility parking at airports has kind of been made redundant, because the whole airport car park is itself very accessible. The pick-up and drop-off area is made for people with luggage. They make the connections as direct as possible. They've got redundancy. They have those little carts that come around and will pick people up and take them if they can't walk very far. They're like a perfect little accessible village, but only within the airport precinct. So, we need more of that kind of design. So have a think about this situational impairment thing, and here's the examples from the previous page. What do you think are some situational impairments that affect people crossing the street? It could be like these ones, or they could be other situations that you can think of.
Just in the chat.
Yeah. It's just as that traffic noise came out, there was a big motorbike went past outside. I mean, depending on your inclination, you could be attracted to a noise like that, go, wow, I wonder what kind of bike that person's got, and then you're not looking at the street, right? Yeah, that comment by Tim is really good, that disability, that's called the social model of disability, that there's no such thing as a impaired person. It's that the environment is disabling. And in an airport, it means that there's it's so much more inclusive. A lot of people don't need to worry about it.
Yeah. So situational impairments, sunlight and shadows, too much signage, talking or texting on the phone, temporary traffic management, restricted sight lines, visibility. A car goes past blasting.
Instagram is a really interesting one. I find even myself, if you go to the traffic lights and you press the button to cross the street, you're like, oh, I'm waiting, what will I do? So tempting to just get your phone out, isn't it? And that's okay. I mean, live your life. But it does take your mind away from the current moment, which is the definition of a situational impairment, really. Young kids, definitely.
Reading the TransLink app,
Yeah.
Yeah. Do that to catch public transport. So it's putting you on your phone.
Deciding whether you trust it or not. Yeah. Carrying a load for sure. Carrying coffees, or especially coffees when you've got more than one and you don't want to drop them. Especially when you brought mugs from the office and they're like, don't have lids.
I was working on a project the other day and it's to an outdoor kind of pool area, one of those beach frontage ones. I'm like, these people don't just have children, they have swimming bags and boogie boards. It's just like enormous situational impairment.
Somebody's just passed away. Gosh, that's a really good point. There's a whole lot of stress and anxiety that's loaded on people. You just don't know what's going on in someone else's life, do you? And we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about driving in a moment. Gosh, I've got a lot to get through. I'll carry on here. We've got an official break for questions coming up, but as you've already worked out, we're happy to stop and have questions in the meantime. So as I said earlier, their difficulty, I think, with inclusion is that we don't have a clear reason for doing it. When we talk about network efficiency, most people know that we can measure kilometres travelled and travel speeds. We also measure queuing and delays right down to a micro simulation level, right? And in road safety, we have really sophisticated maps of crashes and trauma. We understand, because we've analysed that data, what causes a crash, how much of an influence the road and traffic system has on likely crash outcomes. We do it for climate change increasingly, measuring emissions, but for inclusion, there's no outcome measure. There are only inputs, right? Oh, we should design ramps and we should design good crossings. But because we never say why or go back to measure why we're doing those things, then it is very ad hoc. It's very reactive to complaints from people, or depends on the impetus of a particular individual. I think that measuring inclusion is easier than measuring place, Michael. I think there's a more direct outcome measure than place values, and I think it's just equity of participation. So who is participating and who isn't? I can't remember if I say any more about that. No, I don't. So they're basically, in summary, and I can send people, if people are interested, I have more material about this, but there's two ways to measure equity of participation. One is through household travel surveys. So then you can disaggregate by geographic community or by demographics. Where are people going? How often are they going there? And are some people not participating as much as others? There was a study in New Zealand that found that 10% of hospital appointments that were missed were because of a transport problem. So that's an example of transport exclusion and measuring equity of participation. The other way to do it is at street level. So you just do intercept surveys, or increasingly automatic machine learning video surveys of people on the street and crossing the street. And then you can, through those surveys, identify how many wheelchairs there are, how many mobility aids there are, and those things are a proxy measure for accessibility. Or you can do intercept surveys, and then you can ask people about what gender they identify with, how old they are, where they live, and then you can build up this picture of who's participating and who's not. So there are ways to do it, and there are challenges with those methods, but there's challenges with crash data as well, and yet we still use that, don't we? We use it really successfully, even though we know it's incomplete and doesn't tell us every last thing about it. So that's kind of one of my career goals, is that we have equity of participation.
So we do have a couple of questions here. Are people who are excluded likely to participate in a survey?
It depends on your methods, but if you know what you're doing. We did a survey of disabled people's experiences of transport in New Zealand. That's Waka Kotahi research that's been published, and we had 15,000 responses. So they used to say, you know, there's hard to reach populations, and now they would say that actually it's just not reached populations. It's just not traditionally included in the way that you might normally survey. So you don't just chuck something on a council Facebook page. You actually have to go into those communities that you're interested in, get to know them, and then they will share with their networks. So there's ways to do it.
Have we got time for another one?
Yep.
Will parking woes count as transportation problems too?
Oh, 100%. Oh, I have a whole other webinar about parking. And it's quite a challenge actually in this current context of urbanism. There's a lot of people who are talking about down with cars, and you know, parking should be more strictly controlled and managed and more expensive, but mobility parking is hugely valuable. There is a subset of people who cannot walk very far. So even if you have mobility parking, it has to be very close to the destination. So something like, I think 50% of people with a mobility parking permit need to be within 50 metres of their destination, for example. And if that park's taken, then they can't do it. So parking's very important. Yeah.
Let me see. Would the intercept surveys miss people who are not participating?
Yeah, that's the whole point really. So when I say we're counting wheelchairs or something, we know from other surveys how many people who use wheelchairs are in the population. So if you know that, and you're only counting a smaller proportion than that on the street, then there's a different travel demand, isn't there? And so then that's what I mean about building up this more comprehensive picture like we do for crashes, to say, well, if there's this street has 7% of people using wheelchair, which would be very high, and this street has 0.2%. Is that to do with demand, or is it to do with exclusion? And the more data we get, the more sophisticated we could be in teasing out the answers to those questions. Yeah, I think we'll carry on. I'm probably behind the game. Human behaviour in traffic. This is the well, it's all pretty interesting. This is the cool stuff. This is where my PhD research came from. I've always been interested in thinking, and in particular, how you can understand how other people think, because we all live inside our own heads and we can only see outside our own eyes, right? It's so interesting. So that's what I wanted to study for my research. Whoa, wait a sec. What's this got to do with the who of raised crossings? Well, actually, driver behaviour is the crux of road safety for pedestrians and people who used raised crossings, because if there were no humans behind wheels, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. We wouldn't have to raise them. We wouldn't even have to put zebra markings on them. If it was self-driving cars everywhere, you could wander wherever you want to because they all have to stop for you. But at the moment, they don't necessarily do that. And so understanding why is really important. And this is where my PhD came from. I wanted to understand the interaction between how much attention drivers are paying to the task and how safe the outcomes are. Because myself, I know, and I knew that I don't think about driving all the time when I'm driving. Haven't yet killed myself. So there must be some kind of balance where you can be safe and not be thinking about it all the time. Also, there was this billboard on the highway when I was picking my PhD topic, and it said, concentrate, wandering minds cause crashes, just the facts. And I thought, really? How do you know that? How do you know wandering minds cause crashes? Have you measured everybody's wandering mind? And have you done this calculation of wandering mind safe outcomes over wandering mind bad outcomes? And have you got the figure? Because I've never been asked whether my mind is wandering when I'm pulled over by the cops. Not that I'm pulled over by the cops very often. So I wanted to explore the underlying prevalence of mind wandering as a kind of first step to say whether it causes crashes or not. So that's what I did. And as I say, I want to know where on the spectrum the safe behaviour sits. Can you be thinking about other things and still be a safe driver? And if so, how the heck does that happen? And how can we design environments that make that safe? Because a lot of papers that I read would say things like this is my favorite slide of the whole webinar, actually, because there's this awesome resource called Papers Past in New Zealand, and you can just look up a phrase and it will find you that phrase in oldie days newspapers. And the one on the bottom left is the best. If there's any place in the world where silence is really golden, it is in the driver's seat. When the tongue wags, the mind lags. Driving a car is a full-time job. It cannot safely be combined with sociability, lovemaking, sightseeing, window shopping, or daydreaming. As if sociability and chatting to your passenger is as hazardous as lovemaking during driving. That's quite a big call, isn't it? So papers that I read would say things like this, without any qualification. Driver mind wandering is associated with risk. I'm like, how do you know that? So I went about asking people what they think about when they're driving, and comment in the chat, but we're not going to pause, Prue, because I think I'm a bit behind. We chat too much. But comment amongst yourselves in the chat. What do you think about when you're driving? If you don't drive, what do you think drivers think about? Or what do you think about when you're cycling? Yes. So here is a video of how I did this study. I was literally sitting in the car and asking people what they're thinking about. You may not be able to hear it, but that doesn't matter because there are captions. So don't worry if you can't hear what they're saying. So I had a camera, obviously, and that was connected to an app on my phone where I could track where we were going and also record things about what people were saying and observations I had. A lot of people would report more than one thing, thinking about more than one thing at the same time, which I'm sure a lot of you can relate to. So a lot of switching between driving things, completely unrelated things. Typically, as long as their eyes are on the road and their hands are on the wheel, I was all right with that. Sometimes I checked to corroborate these stories. People behind you when you're driving are quite a strong trigger for paying attention. I think we all have this kind of safety bubble. And when someone breaches it, even though we weren't watching for them in the first place, we notice when they're too close for comfort. And then we had a lot of this. A lot of people said actually nothing. And you know what? I believe them. A lot of people were thinking about nothing a lot of the time, and I'm not one of those people. Anyway, the conclusion is, how often do drivers' minds wander? I think half to 2/3 of the time, and it varies by person and it varies by route, but we'll come to that. All drivers report all human drivers report mind wandering at least occasionally. And if you think about it, you have to be able to do that, because when you're driving somewhere, you have to know where you're going, right? You have to think where you're going to turn at the next intersection, which is not immediately in front of you. You have to think about which route you're going to take, where you're going to park at the other end, if that's changing depending on your current assessment of the weather. There's a whole lot of reasons that drivers need to be away from the current moment when they're driving. It's actually really complicated, and humans are amazing. Can we stop them doing that? No, and we don't want to. You can't really separate it from the human condition, but you can do stuff about that in the road environment. So the road affects what people are thinking about. If it's a long, quiet stretch with not much going on, it's essentially related to how predictable it is. If it's very predictable and there's no intersections or, you know, places where people, you'll all know in your own cities and where you're driving around, there are certain locations where you're like, oh, I have to pay attention here. Like that roundabout in the video, I have to pay attention here, it's dangerous. You have this experience of it being a bit dodgy, maybe the visibility's not great, maybe it's really busy with lots of funny angles, and maybe there are a lot of mixed traffic, scooters, kids or something. And most drivers regulate their attention such that they will automatically learn to pay attention at those places because their autopilot doesn't cut it so easily. But on big long stretches like this, people think about dinner or dogs, or just they switch into cruise mode. Actually, Bill Bailey, the comedian from the UK, he defined this, and I cited him in my PhD, which was my biggest achievement. He said, my wife asked me what I'm thinking about, and I say, nothing. I call it standby mode. And he'll just stand there like, it just, there's, it's just a common human thing to zone out, right? To think, I'm literally, don't talk to me, I'm literally thinking about nothing. And that happens when people are driving as well. And as I say, people learn to pay attention at unpredictable places. And this roundabout, I asked people in the middle of it what they were thinking about. And 24 out of 25 were thinking about driving. 5 out of 25, the first thing they said to me was, I hate this roundabout. And I coded that as they're thinking about driving. Their attention is triggered. This roundabout is actually, I think, relatively, it's hard to compare intersections and mid-blocks in terms of safety because the exposure calculation is funny with the approach traffic and stuff. But I think this roundabout is remarkably safe considering its traffic volume and considering how terrible people think it is. And I believe the reason is that everybody slows down and they're super alert and they're actually thinking about driving for the one time in their whole commute. So drivers aren't usually looking around for pedestrians. I asked people what they were thinking about while driving, something like 787 times, and one of them said, I'm just scanning because there tends to be quite a few kids running across the road here. And she was an exemplary driver, like amazing, like superhuman almost in terms of her engagement with the environment. Most people do not do that. And I don't think it necessarily helps to tell people that they should, because it's like telling humans they should grow an extra leg. It's just not the way their brains are wired. So instead, anyway, it's our jobs in the profession, right, to design environments that are safe and predictable. That means slow them down where people might cross the road and wake them up if we have to. One way to do that is a raised crossing. Mm-hmm. So yeah, the summary of it is, if anybody asks you about, oh, shouldn't we put up a sign to tell drivers to pay attention? I would really not recommend that, because people don't notice signs, they don't respond to them, they're not thinking about signage. We need environments that are slow by design and that wake people up at locations where that would be helpful. Oh yeah, so this is, I can't remember if it's in the chat or in Mira in the chat, I think. What kind of driver do you think you are? I think it's the next. There's four different kinds, I reckon. Expertise is correlated with attentional regulation. If somebody who I was driving with was not very good at regulating their attention, like my sister, I reckon, but don't tell her I said that. They tend to be quite kind of jerky and stop-start and not very smooth. They don't have a very good margin of kind of safety between them and the next person. And you notice these people on motorways particularly. Most people driving on a motorway are pretty good at leaving good gaps and you all just get along, right? And there's always one or two who are like right up behind you and then zipping in and out. And they don't think are very good. They think they're awesome drivers, obviously, but they're not, because they're not allowing for this sort of margin of error that we know we should allow for humans. Most of us are competent cruisers, even though we report mind wandering quite a lot. So we can improve the ways that people drive through training and ongoing education, especially when people learn how to drive. That's when the habits are set, and it's really important to practice driving with learner drivers as much as possible so that you get a wider range of conditions as possible to teach them those things about leaving good gaps and regulating your speed, doing those really safe habits. But we literally can't rewire drivers' brains. So putting up that billboard on the state highway that says wandering minds cause crashes, well, okay, it's not necessarily going to help the cause. Although sometimes I do admit that it might be politically useful to pretend that we can do that, because then you might get funding for your broader package of road safety stuff. Yeah. So yeah, if you want to comment in the chat what kind of driver you think you are, or if you have someone in your family who'd like to dob in as a different kind of driver than you are. I think we're pretty close to our break spot. So this is really the crux of why we're talking about all of this stuff. Raised crossings are so useful because not only do they provide a necessarily slow potential conflict point where a driver and a pedestrian, could interact. They also wake the driver up because they're raised, they're visible, and they trigger this braking, they trigger this awareness. So for that reason, we wouldn't, I don't know, we might not want to put them at every single intersection in a city centre because that would be very effortful for people to drive around. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we want everybody to walk around and, use mobility devices if they need to, especially in denser places. But they are going to make people pay attention more than otherwise. And they are safe, obvious, and step-free. And that is a little hint of what's to come. So this is my rewording of this road sign. Concentrate, transport professionals. Failure to account for drivers' wandering minds causes crashes. I should put that on LinkedIn. I think I will. Just the facts. Perfect. 59 past the hour. So what do you reckon, Prue? We've got 5 minutes.
Yep, 5 minutes. There's a couple of questions that I think I'm just going to have to let go for now.
Okay, I might, I've got my snacks on hand, so I'll just pop some responses in the chat while we're waiting.
Okay, awesome.
See you all soon. In traffic. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you're well nourished. So we talked about driver behaviour. People are driving cars and trucks. And what about pedestrians, and what are they thinking about, and what's that got to do with all of this? As it happens, a friend of mine in the traffic psychology world, which is a thing, there's a conference every so often called International Conference of Traffic and Transport Psychology. And if you're interested in this kind of thing, look it up because it's very cool. They have a lot of work on the various stages of automation in cars. There's a lot of research money in Europe in particular on self-driving cars and how the humans adapt to that, especially in the in-between stages of not full autonomy. So when there's some like Tesla level autonomy, what does that do to drivers and road safety? There's a lot of talk about that. And at this conference, there's also themes around pedestrian and cyclist behaviour. And Ilse did her PhD on automaticity, very similar to mine in some ways, familiarity and how that affects people's travel. And she did a study on pedestrians, and this is a picture of her study. She's in the Netherlands, so people are walking on the different side of the footpath, just as they are driving on the different side of the street. And so she stuck this sandwich board that just says welcome to the street, and she stood beyond it and interviewed people afterwards to see whether they'd noticed that there was something there. And she found that most of them didn't notice, even though they'd walked around it. So it's very similar to driving. People will behave the right way without necessarily needing to consciously think about it. What about cycling? Here is evidence of my bike trailer. What are people thinking about when they're cycling? Well, I think that it's a continuum, and I haven't seen any studies about mind wandering during cycling, but I find that when I'm riding a bike, on the one hand, you do it because it's kind of liberating, you get fresh air and it's enjoyable. And when you're on a quiet country cycle path away from the traffic and there's a long stretch with no one around, then of course your mind wanders. That's why you do it. You do these things to relax. Humans for centuries have walked for recreation reasons, and biking similar, right? I have some of my best ideas when I'm riding a bike. also some of my scariest moments. So the regulation, I think, is much more finely tuned when you're more vulnerable. And that means when you're crossing a street as a pedestrian or when you're biking in traffic. So I think there's this continuum between not much mind wandering and lots of mind wandering. And I think we've got a Miro exercise here we do to do that exercise for yourselves. So think about a situation. Now you have to pay attention. I'm allowed to say that. And you will obey. There is a very specific instruction here. So we want a sticky note, and I want you to write a sentence or a statement in this specific format in the speech marks in my example here. A something person walking, cycling, or driving in this specific situation. The example I gave is of an orca because orcas are amazing and very human-like in their intelligence, probably more intelligent than us, but that's another story. So I've said a hungry orca swimming in this situation, a swarm of herring. Well, not much mind wandering because they're fishing for lunch, right? So you pick your own adjective. What kind of person are you going to pick? They could be tired, they could be harried, they could be a working person, they could be an engineering person, they could be a slow person. In this situation, what are they doing? Going for a coffee? Are they running a marathon? Are they picking up the kids from school? And this is a either walking, cycling, or driving person, and they're going to have a wandering mind, or they're going to not, depending on what you think about what they're doing. So we've got an example already. A soggy cyclist riding home in the rain on a busy road. Yeah, we've all been there, right? And immediately I think about, oh, what if you've got a dodgy tire, or one of your lights isn't working? Not much mind wandering. You're just trying to get home. And drivers do this as well. When they want to get somewhere in a hurry, they're hyper-focused. In fact, New Zealand drivers are known internationally because there are standard questionnaires as being much more competitive on average than other drivers internationally. There's a subset of New Zealand drivers who want to get there first. And sometimes there was some of them I could tell you who they were from my participants. I'd ask them what they're thinking about, and they'd say, oh, I should have been in the other lane at that intersection. I would have been in front of this car by now. Like, they're really competitive, even though they're just going home, and it makes literally no difference. Some people just want to win. Oh, this is excellent. A plumber walking across a factory roof. I like how that's in the middle. They might be thinking about it. They might not. A happy person walking in a footpath along a quiet street. A 6-year-old running away from home. Or that's so interesting. It's interesting to think about when children have this idea of a footpath as being different from just walking around their house, right? Like, they don't know the language of transport. It's just a place. That's very interesting to me. A cold person, a stressed person, an exhausted person, sitting on a surfboard during a lull. Well, that's the dream, right? Or maybe it's not the dream. I don't know. I'm not a surfer. You want to be catching a wave? I guess that's the dream. Just sitting on the surfboard. Stop. Tired. Interesting that we've got tired and alert both at the not much mind wandering end. When I did my PhD, I asked all my drivers a questionnaire after every drive. And one of the questions was, how tired are you? Because I wanted to know if there was correlation between being tired and mind wandering, how much they reported mind wandering. And it turns out there wasn't. And some of the drivers, we talked about that, and they said, well, I was paying attention because I knew I was tired. And then some of them were like, they're kind of just vaguely tired and therefore more likely to zone out. So it's quite a complex interaction between fatigue and mind wandering. And that's one of the reasons that learner drivers are at risk, because they haven't necessarily learned about those subtle things, you know, in terms of how you're feeling and therefore how that affects your drive. What's your favorite, Prue?
Oh, it's hard to go past the plumber. I really like that. I feel like we might need to give a prize for that one. And
all right.
Yeah.
Good job, plumber.
That middle realm as well.
Yeah, I like that too.
So if you put the plumber down, can you let us know, and I will add you to the prize list.
Oh, cool. I like how there's like this anonymous prize thing. Just show us your comment and we will judge you.
20 plumbers turn up.
Yeah, it was
Like,
me, it was me. Luigi. Okay, cool. Now, this is the Principles of Inclusive Access, SOS, and if you'd heard of me before today, you might have heard about this because it's my legacy as a transport engineer. It's my gift to the profession. So we're going to talk about that. SOS stands for Safe, Obvious, Smooth, Step-Free Choices. So the SOS principles account for people's wandering minds and they make infrastructure inclusive. Win-win. So I came up with this acronym. I was working with Waka Kotahi, New Zealand Transport Agency, about on pedestrian network design guidance, and as part of that work, they were quite forward thinking, and they commissioned me to go and talk with a whole bunch of disabled people and organisations that represent them just about their walking journeys, just to find out, well, what can we do in terms of guidance to help transport engineers and planners make better decisions. And so when you interview disabled people about transport, gosh, it's so broad and deep, the issues that people have, and it can be really complex, can be really specific to a person. Like some people who use a manual wheelchair are really concerned about crossfalls of the footpath, so the sideways slope. Some of them are really concerned about curb cuts and how smooth that transition is, whereas blind people, of course, are really interested in tactile paving and the difference in texture between a footpath and the road, difference in level. So there's a whole lot of different nuances that can affect all people's travel. And then I interviewed an autistic person, and she was so cool. She was talking about how she doesn't like that people are put in boxes. Everybody's unique. She said even identical twins have different brains. Why do we pretend that everybody's the same? And I thought, well, that's super interesting. And the transport challenge for her was that she would get anxious and have kind of a little panic attack when she was in a situation that overwhelmed her, and that could be as straightforward as getting on a bus. So she'd get on a bus, if she wasn't sure it was the right one, she would freeze and not be able to talk to the bus driver, so she wouldn't even be able to ask if it was the right bus. She also had some challenges in busy car parking areas where the wayfinding wasn't clear, so there's lots of traffic coming and going everywhere, and she wasn't necessarily sure how to get across it. So through talking with all of these people, I was like, well, there's things that make the infrastructure safe that we know about really as transport people, but then it has to be smooth as well because there's so many people with small wheels. But there's this other thing, it has to be obvious. It has to be obvious. So you arrange those and then you get SOS. So I'll go through all of those. This is really, the safe one is part of the reason why I would recommend that access consultants have some connection to the transport profession, because understanding road safety is a really technical thing, and you have to learn how to do that. It's not the same as how safe people feel. There's other factors like traffic volume and speed and safe system principles and everything. So a safe crossing, as you will all know by now, especially after Haveza's session, is something that has survivable speeds. We don't want people to be hit if somebody makes a mistake or doesn't see them, which means that it has to be slow, or it has to separate people by mode or by how exposed they are, how squishy they are. If you don't have a ton of metal around you, then you are more likely to be hurt than if you are in a 5-star rated car, for example. But importantly for, all humans actually, safety includes feeling safe, and a lot of people will avoid a particular walking route because they don't like it, because it's dodgy, or because it's nighttime, or because it's slippery in the rain. And so that's really important for that inclusion outcome that we're seeking, that we want people to make trips. We want those trips to be equitable. We want everyone to be able to do them. So it has to feel safe. And your typical transport planner or engineer has unique perceptions of safety that aren't going to be the same as everybody else's. So this picture is not a priority crossing. Does it affect how safe it is? I would argue mostly not. It doesn't affect how safe it is. It's a safe crossing because, for most people, because drivers will still slow down, as John has already said in the chat, and it alerts drivers to the fact that there are pedestrians there. And I used this crossing before that raised platform went in, and it was a completely different story. However, that crossing is not very obvious to some people. Some people say, oh, I'm not sure it's a crossing, it's not a proper crossing, particularly children or people who are visitors or people who are autistic, for example, or even people who've had a brain injury or people who have dementia might not realise that they can cross the street there. So that's why obvious is here in SOS, and it's my favourite of the principles because it's not obvious to transport engineers that things need to be obvious. They're obvious to us, but we're not the people we're designing for. You can write that down. That's good. So obvious transport systems mean that everybody has their place. I was biking around Paris in 2016 before the e-scooters took over and riots started. And in 2016 and now still, when you're biking around Paris, it's very obvious where to go because they paint little bike symbols. I think it must be every 10 meters on every street. And so there's bikes in the bike lanes. And then when you're in a narrow street that doesn't have a bike lane, there's bikes in the middle like a sharrow. So everyone has their place or they're not meant to be there. And wayfinding should be visual, tactile, audible. So remember that story I told at the very start about Martha and the train station? There should be audible announcements at big bus and train stations about, you know, real-time incidences like changes of platform or cancellations of services. Ideally, that information would be on people's apps as well, so they can be alerted in a way that suits them. And ideally, in a gold-plated system, you'd have staff around who are trained to let people know about what's going on in a variety of ways. So this crossing is not even an official one because it's in a car park, and that's in a big shopping centre in Hamilton. So it's not a raised crossing, but I would argue that there are approximately 0 humans who aren't transport professionals who would know that it's not, you know, legally enforceable road crossing. Everyone just acts like it is. It's very obvious. A zebra crossing is like a universal understood symbol of a place to cross as a pedestrian where traffic will almost always stop for you. And therefore, we have this problem, and this is just a legacy of changing best practice over the years. Road safety practices change pretty quickly, right? Like we used to have flush zebra crossings. We used on, you know, quite high speed roads. We, in where I live anyway, wouldn't probably install a crossing like this anymore, even though this one's only about less than 10 years old. A crossing that is obvious but not safe is going to result in injuries because there's nothing more obvious to a pedestrian than traffic lights. People will say, oh yeah, it's a good crossing. They assume that when they press a button and have the green man, then everybody will stop. But psychologists and road safety professionals know that that's not the case, right? One time in a million or less than that, people won't stop, and then sometimes people will get hit. So at this crossing, there was a fatal collision within a few months of it being installed, and that was a driver approaching it from the roundabout, not even a couple of 100 meters away, and they hit a pedestrian who was walking across with the green man. I think it might have had an extra signal aspect added since then to make it a bit more obvious to drivers, but in any case, the speeds aren't necessarily as safe as they could be. And you can, of course, you can retrofit a raised platform on most signalised crossings. All of these things come down to a trade-off of cost and where in your network you want to invest the money, and that's partly what Prue's going to be talking about tomorrow or next time, around how you make these decisions about where to put things. What about asphalt art? So I've had a little bit of input into some guidance in New Zealand around pavement art or roadway art, and the conclusion is that it's probably safe, but it's not very obvious and therefore not very inclusive. There are some people, like parents of autistic children, for example, who would avoid this crossing like the plague because they do not want their child to learn that there are nuances in what a road looks like. A road should look like a road if it's got traffic on it. And art is awesome, and we should have it in a lot of public places, but not on the road surface, is my professional opinion. And that's coming through in guidance from the UK now as well, that they've banned asphalt art because of backlash from the disability sector. So the last S in SOS is smooth step-free choices, and that's the one that's probably the most familiar in terms of inclusive design to road and transport professionals. We know that we should have ramps instead, well, in parallel to stairs. We should have smooth crossings. We shouldn't have too big lips on our curb cuts. Gravel surfaces are not very step-free. If you have a roadwork site and pedestrians are directed through a detour, that's not a smooth surface, then there will be people who can't use it. And at the moment, because we don't talk to people about that or measure the outcomes or go and count pedestrians using roadwork sites and dive into the data, then it's not very objective in terms of enforcing those kinds of things. But we all know that it's a good idea to have smooth step-free choices. It doesn't mean though that it doesn't mean that we can't have steps in public places. It just means that we have alternatives that are well signposted and they're not through dodgy back alleys or anything like that. So there's a couple of questions about art. Does asphalt art include using red on wombat crossings? In New Zealand, we don't use red on crossings for a different reason, and it's that some people with a specific vision condition can't differentiate between the red and the white, so we stick to white on black. You can use red in advance of the crossing. I think Ken talks about this in his module, actually. Cobblestone or concrete art on a raised platform in a shared zone. Shared zones are problematic as well. I would say in a shared zone, what I would do, and I've got an example of it later, I think, is at least have a formal, obvious crossing within the shared zone. That's what I would do. So at either end, if it's not too long, or in the middle, have either a signalized or literally have a zebra crossing in that shared zone, because if you can put yourself in the place of someone who doesn't understand what that's all about, at least give them an accessible route alongside the building edge and accessible crossings at some locations. That makes it a lot more inclusive. How steep is too steep when we're designing smooth step-free choices? This is guidance that's coming out soon. I'm very excited about this graph. This was based on interviews with people who use wheelchairs on the streets of Auckland, and we asked them whether they could use this sample of streets, whether they could use them easily, with difficulty, or not at all. And then we went and measured the gradients of those streets and came up with this graph. So it's not like there's a line in the sand that says this gradient is great for everybody and this one is rubbish. Humans are humans, right? And people who use wheelchairs are kind of have different amounts of energy and power. Sometimes literally there's power attachments people can put on their wheelchairs. So typically up to about 4 or 5% is okay. And then for a block length of footpath, beyond that, it gets very difficult. So that can perhaps help us prioritize accessible routes at a network level, at a neighborhood level, to say, well, these gradients, some people can't use them anyway, so why don't we prioritize these other routes? Yeah. So as I said, not all infrastructure needs to be step-free, and it's the same with road crossings. Not every road crossing needs to be safe, obvious, and step-free. It's good to give choices because we have objectives other than inclusiveness. We also have mode shift objectives, which means that we want to give people as many opportunities to cross the street as we reasonably can. Sometimes a refuge island, or having 10 refuge islands and one race crossing, is maybe a good thing, and that's up to the judgment of the transport professionals involved in terms of how that money is spread around. It depends depends on the traffic volumes and speeds, where people want to come from and go to. This is a different mirror exercise as well. It's not that one. Sorry for putting the wrong thing on there. I got all carried away with my mirror changing around yesterday. This one's way better anyway. So exercise 4, we all go back to Miro. Choose one of these crossings. These are all crossing examples from my hometown. There's a pop quiz for you, John. Tell me where all of these are. And just choose one, or if you're really quick, you can do more than one. And give it a grade or a sticker or a comment in terms of whether it's SOS or not, and why you think that is. The top one is pretty normal for us, refuge island at a single lane roundabout. Quite high volume, really, for Hamilton. The second one is a raised platform at mid-block signals. Quite busy, there's 3 lanes of traffic. The third one is a Wombat. It's on white on red. That's probably the only downer, but you know, spoiler alert, it's pretty good. Also, the directional tactiles on one side are weird. I don't know what's going on there. And then the fourth one is just curb cuts at a little suburban side street. So think about SOS. Are they obvious? They're not obvious. And to whom, right? Like, if you were a blind person, would you know the difference approaching some of these intersections versus others? If you were a 10-year-old child going to get some milk from the shop, would you cross here? Would you let your kid? If you had a visiting aunt who can get around all right but isn't that quick, would you send them across these crossings? These are the kinds of things that we should think about. And are there things, information I've not given you that you would need to make that judgment? I love this. I might take a screenshot of this page and use it for nefarious purposes. I also love the variety of stickers and stuff people are finding. I thought that skateboard was a sausage for a second. A jelly bean. So that comment that down the bottom, it says may be appropriate depending on volumes of traffic and pedestrians. I wouldn't mind giving that person a prize, Prue, because that's what I reckon about that one as well. There are literally thousands of crossings like that in both of our countries, and we don't have the money to go around and wombat all of them, right? So if we've got streets that might be a cul-de-sac that nobody sees, and it might border a local road that has not got much traffic on it either, it actually might be fine. I haven't looked in detail at those curb cuts, how well aligned they are. It might be that it's actually appropriate, and if we're going to put in 1 raised crossing or even 50 raised crossings in our city, that one wouldn't make the list.
It's interesting. One of the things I've noticed when we're taking people out on site, practitioners and things, I'll put someone in charge of deciding if there's a safe gap when we're crossing a place like that. I do the same with my children. And often people will give way to the major road of traffic because they can't tell which cars are going to turn. So to predict a safe gap, they end up giving way to all of the cars on that major road. So I often look at the volumes on the major road, not necessarily the minor road, depending on, you know, how well and how obvious it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Turning in time, if there's a slip lane, turning lane, it might be easier.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to tell sometimes with these are just screenshots from Street View, actually how wide these intersections are, what the curb radii are like. That one's certainly not the worst that I've seen.
No, that looks good. It's quite good. So who was that who put down the comment?
It was Tim Boxall. He's already claimed it.
Okay.
Oh, and Michael wants to know what's the percent of trucks at these locations. Yeah, absolutely. There's information that I haven't given you. That varies. If there were a truck depot down that little side street at the bottom, well then yeah, maybe it's not so good. Yeah.
Yeah, we have one of that on a major bikeway in Brisbane where there's a concrete batching plant or something. So concrete trucks just constantly every time.
Yeah. Okay, cool. We'll move on. So here's a picture of essentially a shared zone. This is Victoria Street in Hamilton where I live, and this one's quite old. I think this might be almost 20 years old actually. It's a really slow raised section of street. There's no difference in level between the public space, the footpath and the traffic lane. But there's signals in the middle of it, and I just think it's great because some people use the signals, some people don't, and it is not a big crash spot, right? If you're driving through there, you know to expect people crossing the road, and I think it works really well. So that's what I mean about giving people a SOS option, even if the safety of the environment means that you know, fatal and serious crashes are not going to be common, you might be inadvertently excluding people if we don't give them those choices. So it's a different objective from safety, really. It's about inclusion and yeah, welcoming all people. I might just, while I'm on that, there's an extra, we're not going to do it now, but in Miro, there's an extra over to the side. It says extra for experts, exercise. I don't want you to do it now, but this is my Venn diagram of safe, obvious, and step-free. If you want to, you can make a diagram like that or take a screenshot of this one and send me or do your own LinkedIn post about a safe, obvious, step-free crossing that you know. Or even better, pick a crossing that doesn't tick all 3 boxes and only ticks 1 or 2, because those ones are the ones we want to train our peers about. Say, well, actually, it's safe and it's step-free, but it's not obvious. Particularly those ones are really interesting to instruct people with. So I've done an example on the one on the right to say, here's my picture of a raised zebra crossing that's at a roundabout in, it's a new raised crossing at a roundabout in Hamilton, raised zebra, and I think it's awesome. So that ticks all 3 boxes, but you might be able to think of one that doesn't do that, that's only ticks 2, and that's, like I say, really important for learning. So if you could do that, if you put it on LinkedIn, you tag me and I'll be like, yes, and I'll share you, and then you'll be famous.
I think that one looks quite cost effective too. It looks like
it's just a lump. Yeah.
I think that people should be given prizes for these kind of outcomes if they can get them in cost effectively.
I love those ones. The locals hate it, apparently, or the vocal locals, because, you know, it's caused traffic carnage and everybody died. So that's unfortunate. But if you're a pedestrian and it's a residential area, there's shops and schools, it's just the perfect place to improve that connectivity. And I think it's a big hit. So anyway, if you are keen, then you either take a screenshot and either email that to me. Let me know if you're happy for me to share it on my LinkedIn or put on LinkedIn and tag me, and then we can continue the discussion, and that would be really fun. So now we're going to talk about bringing all these things together, and then we're going to touch on disability sector engagement in the last little bit. So to summarise, raised crossings work for all people, despite drivers' wandering minds, because they're really conspicuous. They are likely to interrupt a driver's daydream, but it doesn't even matter if they don't, because drivers have to slow down. What happens when people are driving is that they develop these autopilot kind of scripts. This is this kind of environment, therefore this is how I should behave, and that becomes an unconscious process really quickly when people are learning how to drive, or when something new happens. So people will notice that, oh, that's new, and then after a while they'll forget that it's even there and they'll just behave accordingly. And raised crossings are like that. If there's no pedestrians around, a driver is not likely to remember that they've driven over a raised crossing, even though they slowed down. And that's great, right? It's good for traffic safety independent of pedestrians as well. And also they're really obvious, not just because they're a zebra, but because they're raised, they're more visible, they're on the path of travel, there's no change in level. They are really good. So when we think about combining why we're doing these things and who we're designing them for, it goes back to the safe system principle of humans are vulnerable, they make mistakes, they're not perfect robots, they're not operating at perfect human Olympic level alertness and capability every single second of the day, right? So we need to build in these affordances, and this is one way that we do that. Now, Prue's going to talk next time about where we put a crossing, and that depends on all of these contextual things that we've just been talking about. It depends also on the community and a whole lot of other stuff that Prue's going to talk about, but thinking about who those people are and the range of people that we can expect in any kind of community or place is super important, and a good reason to advocate for these kind of crossings a lot of the time. And especially the how, and this is something that's been really apparent to me learning about psychology and human factors. A lot of our design standards really come from understanding the science of human performance and human limitations, and all of these fancy formulas we have for sight distance that incorporate reaction times and visibility. They're all about the human brain, what it can process, how long it takes to process those things, how much tolerance we should build in. It's treating the human as a material in that civil engineering brain calculation that relies on the properties of materials and their limitations and the margins of error for those things. So crossings that are SOS work for everyone, and I implore you when you're out and about with your families to say, well, yes, that crossing is safe and step-free, but it's not obvious, and then you can educate the masses. So now I'm going to talk about disability sector engagement and why that's important. Now, in New Zealand, anyway, and most countries actually, it's the same. We have government authorities. They start with national, federal level authorities. Then we have regional ones, city and district ones, and then off to the side we have all these other stakeholders that we tend to engage with. And I remember once, for example, I was in a business case workshop about a state highway corridor, and there were representatives there from these agencies. There was also 2 different representatives from trucking agencies, so essentially the heavy freight sector and lobby, but there was nobody there representing the communities that the state highways bowled through. There was nobody there representing children, nobody representing older people or disabled people. So we don't really, well, increasingly we do, but historically we haven't had a very strong community input, especially into micro level decision making or priorities about what kinds of infrastructure we put where. And as I said earlier, we put all of that stuff in a spreadsheet really effectively most of the time for road safety, for emissions, for network efficiency. We can gather all of our metrics, put it in a tool or calculation, and it will tell us where the investment should best be spent to get the outcome we want. For inclusion, most of the projects that I work on is because someone at a council has been lobbied by a disability sector organisation, or they just have their eyes open and they recognise a need, but they've got no clue whether it's a good idea to invest in this thing or not, and if so, where to put something, because there's no objective data around it. It's just plucked out of the air and we think it's a good thing to do. So in the absence of those objective tools and processes, like my beautiful graph that I've made, then we need to talk to people. In road safety, we know that we're reducing crashes and we have all the different parts of the system working together on that goal. Accessible and inclusive transport, we don't really have a vision. We don't have any priorities because we don't measure anything, so we can't tell what crossing to upgrade first from an inclusive perspective. We don't do any monitoring and we don't have this underlying question. So it's important to engage because while we're all relatively equally vulnerable to road crashes, you know, we know how it varies by mode, we know differences by age if someone's involved in a crash. But in terms of how people experience their environment, the transport profession doesn't have the same breadth of experiences as the human population that we're designing for. It's like we're in this little subset of the normal distribution, and the human population we're designing for is way more diverse than us. They all see the world differently, experience the world differently, have different levels of pain and energy and stress and physical capabilities, and different cultural backgrounds as well. So there's just some stats from a survey that we did of the transport profession compared to the New Zealand population. So that's the problem. We don't have the same lived experience, so we can't just rely on ourselves to know what to do. We don't have the right tools and processes yet to make those decisions objective, so we need to talk to the community about how to do it. And this paper is actually online on the Waka Kotahi website now, and the Pedestrian Network guidance about disability sector engagement, how to do it and why, and I'm about to run through the steps in that process. So I talk about what we do now in terms of accessible transport as reactive advocacy. And a lot of people in council, really well-meaning people, do a lot of good work based on feedback and engagement with accessibility groups. So we have accessibility advisors in council, we have accessibility advisory groups in council, but that's still what I would call a reactive process. We don't really proactively measure and understand the problem and include people. So how and why to engage with disabled people? As I say, this is a flow chart within that paper that is in the learning management system. So you don't need to write this down or anything, you can find it. This is the questions that we ask ourselves. If we have a project, do we know whether that affects disabled people as a distinct group? Yeah, sometimes they do. In fact, a lot of the time they do. This project will affect disabled people. Sometimes our projects don't, and that's perfectly okay. If it's about pavement material specifications, then disabled people are affected no differently from the general population, pretty much. You could argue that different size chip seal affects people differently in terms of smoothness of ride and stuff, but generally, just carry on, keep calm. If disabled people are impacted by something, then the question becomes, are they impacted at a general level across the whole nation or jurisdiction, or are there some people who are specifically affected in this local area? And specific local communities means, are you digging up a street right now? Then that's specific. If it's a plan change or a new rule or a research project, then you want to talk to disability sector organisations and the people who represent them. So changes to policy, general submissions on district, city plans, that kind of thing. But if it's a local street, like at the local school, then we can find specific local communities, and there is advice in that guide about how to do that, like literally what organisations to contact and how to find them at a local level in New Zealand anyway. And it will be different in different states of Australia, but you can follow the same process and find the same organisations to get that specific input. And the reason we do that is that in the local context like this, it might be that disabled people say, actually, not many people use this crossing because there's another entrance to the school that's way easier, or there's mobility parking over here and everybody drives here because it's too far away, or for some reason there's no specific need, but there quite likely will be a need as well. And it might be that they say, actually, if you move the crossing to this side of the school, then that would align better with this path or something else like that. So there's always local context that is going to be useful to find out about. And we can use those stories to our advantage because, as we all know, it's not necessarily straightforward to get funding and investment in road safety treatments, raised crossings, pedestrian infrastructure. Sometimes there can be political backlash. So if we have individual stories about what these projects mean to people, how they help them to live good lives, that can be super, super helpful, not just for one project, but for your next one as well, to say, well, we did this crossing, and here's an example. This is a true story from some raised crossings that were installed about 10 years ago in Hamilton, city of the future. And I have a friend whose mother lived nearby, literally, and she said she used to get people to go to the shop for her. Now she can walk to the shop herself. And you can just imagine the value that that gives to someone's life, from being almost literally housebound to actually being able to get out. They can talk to people, they get fresh air, the benefits of the walk, all because we've put in a raised crossing and enabled a trip that wouldn't have been made otherwise. When we did this project, we counted people, I don't think it's on here, but we counted people crossing the road before and after the raised crossings went in. And I wish we collected more data because it wasn't statistically robust, but we had an 80% increase in people who used mobility aids crossing the street, within an overall 30% increase in pedestrians. So more people crossing, but an even bigger increase in people who really needed a good crossing. And that's the kind of data that I'd love to see the industry collect a whole lot more of, because it just says so much about how useful these crossings are and what they can add for people's lives. Especially when you consider that for people who find moving difficult, one trip is way more valuable than it is to somebody who moves around all the time anyway, right? Like, you imagine how it was in lockdown, where you couldn't really go anywhere and everyone's like, oh, it's so good to get out of the house for my walk once or twice a day. Imagine if you couldn't do that and then having that enabled for you, like what a difference that would make. So that's why this stuff is really important. There's a whole other kind of research thread around valuing those journeys and valuing different people's journeys differently, depending on how many of them they have. I was at a meeting in Paris once, casual flex, best meeting ever. And we were talking about valuing the first trip of the day as distinct from an average trip. Like at the moment, transport economics values all travel equally, essentially. But actually, the first trip of the day is way more valuable if it's the only one you do compared to the 12th trip if you've already done 11 and you're like, oh, I'll just hop out and do something else that I could have actually done earlier. If someone does none, going from none to one is huge, not just for the goods or services that they're, acquiring on that trip, but for their mental health, for their social health, for their well-being. It's a really interesting kind of area to think about. So in summary, I think there's still a mirror thing here. Oh no, in the chat. Comment in the chat. What have you learned today about why raised crossings are a good design solution for all people? Actually, you can say anything cool that you've learned today, or your favorite takeaway, or your favorite emoji, or what snacks you had. Put something in the chat, please. Look, I'm literally eating popcorn and waiting for you.
Anything goes. Based on the emojis, I have no idea what we're going to get here.
I wouldn't say, by the way, that's a true universal fact that 50% of blind people don't know what tactiles are. That was one anecdote, but it stuck with me, obviously. Very cool.
Bridget, I loved the phrase in this one when you were talking about this is about your careers and what you can do with your careers to serve your community. I thought that was a different way of putting what this training and what training is about.
I think that often, actually, all of the modules, they're about why we're here. And raised crossings are just one example of how to do a good job.
Yeah.
A lot of the principles across all the different modules are applicable, even in rural road safety or any other kind of discussions of infrastructure. I think that's probably why it's a popular course, because, yeah, it's specific, but it's also general. And people do tell us, yeah, they learn a lot. Slogans may not be backed by PhD research. Some PhD research is not backed by research. That's another story though. Okay, cool. So here's a summary. These slides are here, and they're in the slides are in the learning modules, kind of the main ones if you did want to take any notes. Just a summary of what we've said. Drivers' minds are wandering most of the time. I've got a friend who's blind, and he hates when I do this talk because he's like, it freaks me out. I was scared enough as it is walking around as a blind person. Now you're telling me drivers aren't even concentrating? You do not like that. Human states and traits are important. I think that's really interesting. I like thinking about that when I wake up. How much energy do I have? We're not all just automaton robots wandering around. That Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, I really encourage you to share that with your workmates. Even just print out that chart and put it in your tea room or something. Community demographics can be really useful to make some charts like I had about the age distribution of the people you're working for. SOS is a really sticky thing for people to remember. I'm sure if I quiz you on that in 20 years' time, take it to your graves. So that's it. If anyone has any other questions, you will all see Prue next time.
I have a couple of reminders. A reminder for people to do their homework. So we'll need that done before the next session, at least 24 hours before the next session, so I can download that data and we'll talk through some of that data in our next session. So that's one of the things. If you haven't got onto that, it's not complicated. I've just put the link to the survey. That's where you'll document your answers and responses to that. So you need to do the walk activity, go for a walk, and then you use the survey to document what you found. That's it. But also just a big thank you to Bridget. I think there was so much in today's presentation, and it's just thinking about thinking was another theme that I got out of here. I'm like, don't be afraid to think about thinking. This is actually an important part of our job. Whilst we've got lots of standards and guidance that has evolved over a long time to acknowledge that, I think in the space of pedestrian infrastructure, we're still crossing frontiers all the time. It's there's new stuff happening, and we do need to be thinking not just about, you know, applying existing standards, but making sure that the standards are adapting to the environments we're in. So we'll talk about tomorrow in the WARE session, we'll go through some of the stuff about children's visual looming and things like that, which is how they can judge gaps in traffic and things like that. So something that hasn't yet really been converted into a standard to account for it in some aspects. So
Brilliant.
yeah.
Cool.
You've got a couple of minutes, Bridget. Do you want any more questions if people want, or what do you think? Final question for Bridget. I'm going to keep it open for a couple more minutes just in case there's anything anybody wants to put through at this time.
I did love everybody's feedback about what they got out of today. It was really good.
I'm not sure what that one is.
Thanks, Dale.
You got
The keyboard wandered. All good.
Okay, I think we'll finish it up.
Okay, awesome. Hey, everyone, just feel free to message me. Obviously, I love talking about this stuff. So it'd be great to stay in touch with you and enjoy the next 2 modules. Thanks very much for your engagement. Great group.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.